from CGTN headquarters in Beijing. This is The Hub with Wang Guan.
Hello and welcome to The Hub on CGTN. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. In the ultimate about-face, U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, deviating from America's own pledge that there will only be unofficial relations with the island. China boosted its military deterrence in and around the Taiwan Strait after Nancy Pelosi's visit, and Beijing voiced its strongest opposition to Washington in recent decades.
The statement says U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi blatantly disregards China's solemn representation against visiting Taiwan. It says this act has seriously violated the One China principle and seriously harms China's sovereignty. The open political provocation has aroused the stronger anger of the Chinese people and has met widespread opposition in the international community. The statement says this again proves that some U.S. politicians have degenerated into troublemakers in China-U.S. relations, and the U.S. has become the biggest saboteur of the peace process across the Taiwan Strait and regional stability. What the U.S. should do is immediately cease violating the purpose and the principle of the UN Charter and stop playing the Taiwan card to destabilize the Asia-Pacific region.
Now, what could be China's countermeasures going forward, and what are the repercussions for China-U.S. relations and for cross-strait relations? To discuss all this, I'm joined today in Los Angeles by Jonathan D. Pollack, a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for East Asia Policy Studies, and the Thornton China Center at the Brookings Institution, and here in Beijing, China, by Qingguo, professor at the School of International Studies at Peking University. Gentlemen, welcome. Professor Jia, let me go to you first. What do you think are the motives, the intention of Nancy Pelosi's visit? She's making the visit against all odds.
Well, she claims that she wants to promote democracy. But the problem is most people think that he's playing politics. She is trying to establish her own interests, credibility as a politician. As the U.S. midterm election is coming up, probably she calculated that this is good for the Democratic Party she represented. And the ultimate result probably will not unfold as she expected. I think probably domestically, eventually, people would challenge her claims. This has nothing to do with promoting democracy in Taiwan. It's all about domestic politics and her own interests.
All right, I want to hear from Dr. Pollack. Dr. Pollack, what do you think? Why did Nancy Pelosi make such a controversial decision by visiting Taiwan, which Beijing has regarded part of its own?
Well, this is clearly something that she has wanted to do for some time. I'm not defending the trip. I think Qingguo is correct. There is a political motive here, but the irony here is that this is not something that I believe that President Biden really wished to happen at this time. And yet she stubbornly persisted. Maybe he didn't put enough pressure on her, I don't know. But either way, there is a political motivation here. As we know, she has had a long and very troubled relationship with China, going back at least to the time of the Tiananmen events. And she is very determined. So I think that Biden, representing the executive branch, now has to deal with the reality, the consequences of what she was determined to undertake.
Professor Jia, what do you think of Washington's narrative that there's a division between U.S. Congress and the executive department, i.e. the White House And Biden doesn't necessarily have control over Nancy Pelosi's decision, and Nancy Pelosi is not representing the U.S. government. There's no change in one China policy, so on and so forth. How do you look at those narratives propagated by Washington?
I think there is a division in terms of how to approach this. Nancy Pelosi believes that this is the right way to do things, to challenge China on the Taiwan issue, and to show U.S. Solidarity with Taiwan. And in this way, she and her party can benefit from this. But from the administration's perspective, this is a very risky operation. It's not going to help advance U.S. interests. It's going to be destabilizing and risking sparking a military confrontation in the Taiwan Strait. So they do have very different views as to how to approach this. As to whether the administration has the power to stop her, I think it does. But it's unwilling to use it for, again, domestic political reasons. The U.S. Congress is united, and also probably the Washington Circle. There is a big consensus to get tough on China. And the Taiwan issue is one handle they employ to get tough on China. So the administration does not want to offend these people and chose not to take more forceful measures to dissuade her from going to Taiwan.
I mean, after all, Joe Biden, as a Democrat, could potentially benefit from a Democratic resurgence, if any, during the midterm elections. The polls indicate that the Democrats only had a 17% chance of retaining the House. But let's talk about the repercussions here. We've seen Chinese PLA navies and the Air Force boosting and increasing their deterrence, military drills in and around the island of Taiwan. The Chinese PLA drones, according to reports, flew over Kinmen and Matsu Islands. What do you make of those Chinese gestures? Let me start with you, Dr. Professor Jia. What do you think will happen next militarily?
I think, since Nancy Pelosi chose to disregard the norms of, practice in managing the Taiwan issue, the Chinese side believes that it does not have to observe the past norms of, managing the cross-strait relations. In other words, it would take more forceful measures to demonstrate its resolve to maintain China's sovereignty, territorial sovereignty. And we are going to see such military operations more often, both as a demonstration of China's displeasure with Nancy Pelosi's visit, and also its resolve to defend China's territorial integrity and to prepare for an eventual takeover of Taiwan by force, if necessary, in the event of Taiwan independence.
Right. Dr. Pollack, what do you think would be the repercussions here militarily? How do you think Nancy Pelosi's visit will escalate tensions across the Taiwan Straits?
Well, it already has, but these are just the beginning phases of what might materialize in the coming weeks and months. I'm not predicting an acute crisis, but what I do see is that as China responds to what it sees as an infringement on its sovereignty and so forth, The United States will be in a position that it feels compelled to respond. This is not what I think either
How far would
country
Washington
could
go?
possibly want. That's speculative. I think that I'm not privy to what is under deliberation inside the White House or inside the Pentagon, but I think that they are looking for steps that will, in some measure, on the one hand, reaffirm what the U.S. sees as its commitments to Taiwan, but do it in a way that does not trigger a much larger potential set of consequences. Now, that's a hard thing to do. As you know, the U.S. has forces that deploy in waters that are close to the mainland, and there certainly would be an expectation, I think, in the Congress in particular, to increase the defense assistance provided to Taiwan. As we all know, the United States does not have a formal security commitment to Taiwan. It has not ever since the time of normalization. But there are pressures to have the United States do more, coming from the Congress in particular, that create the possibility of some kind of a crisis that I, again, cannot believe that either Washington or Beijing would wish to see. But that possibility is there for the very simple fact that when you are dealing with the movements of military forces and the like, things happen, not by design, but as a consequence of higher levels of activity. My own view, though, would be that what the U.S. and China should be trying to do now is to find ways in which they, in fact, deal with one another, limit the risks in a very, very candid and open way. But the state of our political relationship and our strategic relationship with China is so unsettled right now. So I have to believe, however, that U.S. officials must be in contact with Chinese counterparts, and with a little luck, I hope, we can avoid the worst, because the consequences for the region as a whole of the idea of just an ongoing test of wills and higher levels of military activity means that sooner or later things are going to happen that are not good, without my predicting what they might be.
Yeah, Dr. Pollack, you talk about America's commitment to Taiwan, which is interesting because there is a phenomenon right now whereby America came into this international treaty with China, namely the three communiques pledging, one China policy, pledging that Taiwan is part of China. But on the other hand, there is such a thing as Taiwan Relations Act, the so-called 6 assurances to Taipei, both domestic U.S. laws, which are undercutting and torpedoing in spirit the three China-U.S. communiques. Dr. Jia, how do you look at this phenomenon? Do we have a precedent in international relations where domestic laws are, overriding international treaties, regulating bilateral ties?
Well, I think the Taiwan Relations Act is a reflection of U.S. Domestic politics of the time. I think for the Carter administration to go ahead with normalization of relations with China, he faced a lot of domestic political opposition, and the Taiwan Relations Act was a sort of a compromise to assure those people. So at the beginning, the U.S. government was quite strict in terms of keeping the relationship with Taiwan, unofficial. But over time, the U.S. Government has gradually changed its policy, undermining bit by bit its commitment.
Yeah, the hollowing out the one China
In
principle, right?
communicates, yeah, like selling weapons to Taiwan and also more weapons to Taiwan, and then the six assurances. These are not laws, but sort of policy. So now it seems to me that the U.S. has changed its policy of one China policy, despite the fact that it has been saying that it hasn't changed it. So at the time when China and the U.S. Normalized relations, there was a kind of a tacit understanding. That is, the U.S. would not have official relations with Taiwan. At the same time, China would push for peaceful unification policy. But now the U.S. has given up its own commitment, so China is also switching from its policy from by under by more emphasis, giving more emphasis to uh, eventual military takeover of Taiwan if Taiwan goes independent.
Yeah, we've heard from Beijing, from Hua Chunying, the spokesperson of the Foreign Ministry of China, saying, the move made by Pelosi will only accelerate the process of the eventual reunification. Dr. Pollack, what do you think? Is this political betrayal by Washington? I mean, promising one China policy by one hand, and on the other hand, sending one of its most official persons to Taiwan, a region it says is only going to keep unofficial ties.
Well, I think Professor Jia has very, very accurately characterized the shifts over time in U.S. policy, but also to some extent it is also reaction to what the United States sees as changes in China as well. That at the time of normalization, there seemed to be a degree of common interest between the two that has eroded over time in significant ways. And frankly, I think that neither country is really paying close and careful attention to how their current decisions are affecting the possibilities for a stable, constructive relationship between our two countries. We're the biggest economies in the world. We're increasingly powerful, but we're not behaving, and by we, I mean either the United States or China, are not behaving in ways that reflect the scale and scope of these issues and where the international system goes in the years to come. To me, rather than revisiting too much the reasons why or the circumstances why there was change in the thinking of both leaderships, the question has to be, what do they do now to limit the risks, to limit the damage, and to deal as two very powerful states that really cannot possibly desire a fundamental breakdown in the U.S.-China relationship, whether for economic reasons, political reasons, or strategic reasons. So when I ask myself these questions, I think we have to be looking ahead. I'm not trying to trivialize the issues of where we find ourselves at the moment, but it's really becomes a question, what do we do now? What do we do now to limit the risks, to limit the dangers? I mean, China is about to undertake a whole series of military activities, as you've alluded to, very, very close to Taiwan. We have to find a way in that context to make sure that events do not get out of hand, and that a way is somehow found for both governments to deal candidly and in very sober fashion with one another, so that events do not spill out of control, because there is that inherent risk, that inherent possibility of a very, very severe crisis, which, again, as I say, I cannot believe that either leadership desires that at all.
Yeah, it remains to be seen if Pelosi's visit could be the last straw on the camel's back of any sort. Let's talk about the economic repercussions. Professor Jia, China's Ministry of Commerce, has said it will suspend exports of natural sand to Taiwan starting yesterday. And the ministry also said that the suspension was imposed in accordance with related laws, And meanwhile, China's General Administration of Customs said several kinds of food, including orange, among other things, and seafood, for example, would not be imported from Taiwan to the Chinese mainland. What signal is Beijing sending through these economic sanctions?
Well, basically, Beijing has been saying that, look, the DPP leaders, if you want peace and development, you should not mess up with the sovereignty issue. So they have a chance. They had a chance not to invite Nancy Pelosi. They had a chance to decline her visit, but they went along with it, and actually said a lot of things that are very provocative to Beijing. So this is China's reaction, and I think if the people in Taiwan suffer, they should blame the DPP authorities for taking irresponsible actions on this issue.
We're talking about economic considerations. Chips is a big part of Nancy Pelosi's visit. Nancy Pelosi met with Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company Chairman Mark Liu. The company is, of course, the world's largest contract chip maker, and the two sides discussed the possibilities of new chip manufacturing plants, the opening of them in the United States. In the grand scheme of things, Dr. Pollack, how do you think the issue of chips play into Nancy Pelosi's consideration when she's in Taiwan?
Well, I think probably in the case of her visit, that was what we might call an add-on. I don't know that this was a driving factor, but I do think that she has been trying to emphasize, and I'm not defending her conduct as such, but she's trying to find some kind of a way, and she's not alone in this respect, to reorient the U.S.-Taiwan economic relationship, to give meaning to it in a way where, as we know, Taiwan has these incredibly advanced semiconductor capabilities, and that through that you form links that are much more long-term, and presumably, I guess, and I'm speculating here on her thinking, to limit the dependence on China. These are a larger set of questions that have come to the fore, especially under the Trump administration, but in many respects continuing under the Biden administration, that I think go against the grain of what had been the dominant basis of U.S. policy, both in relation to China as a whole, and it should not be to treat Taiwan as some kind of a bargaining chip, if you will, in this relationship. There's a lot of reasons why there has to be a different way that we go about these issues, but clearly Pelosi is looking for moves that she thinks will enhance the relationship with Taiwan, but without regard, frankly, to the consequences here, particularly the fact that, it is made evident by the recent decisions coming from Beijing, it is Taiwan that will bear the brunt of this economic punishment, which cannot be healthy for Taiwan's economy and for Taiwan's domestic stability. Let's see what really materializes in the coming weeks and months. As I said before, I really think there can be ways that you avoid an acute crisis, but underneath that is still some kind of a belief that the interests here between the mainland and Taiwan are no longer convergent, and the U.S. is looking for ways to reinforce that divergence, which I think from the point of view of the United States, American companies, is also unhealthy. But this is the dynamic that is now at play between the U.S. and China, in which obviously Taiwan plays a very, very big part. And I would like to think that American politicians and also Chinese politicians would think carefully about where are they trying to go. What is it that you expect to achieve through these reversals in policy direction that will, frankly, cause the potential for really severe risks that will damage the interests of everyone involved.
Well, after this controversial trip, which Beijing considers political betrayal by Washington, Professor Jia, where is U.S.-China relations headed from here?
Well, it's heading from bad to worse. I think I agree with Jonathan that it's time for the officials, leaders of the two countries to take this very seriously and talk to each other and try to find out ways to stabilize the relationship. The instability and continued deterioration of the relationship is going to damage the fundamental interests of not only the two countries, but also of the world. And if the Taiwan issue is not handled well, the two countries may face a military conflict, which is terrible for both countries. I think it's time to take it very seriously and find ways to manage the relationship and try to stabilize it.
Yeah, Dr. Pollack, we have about 1 minute left. Your final thoughts?
Yes, I would very much agree with Qingguo that this is not a time for the playing of games and the taking of risks. We have to find ways, both countries, as very major powers in the international system, to stabilize, to avoid the risks of direct military conflict, and to find ways to communicate more than in dueling press releases or whatever else, to communicate, I would hope to think, privately, so that we can avoid the situation going from truly bad to even worse. This will not be a time that reflects favorably on either country as we look ahead, if circumstances go from bad to worse.
All right, gentlemen, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your perspectives on this very important question, the question of Taiwan, Nancy Pelosi's very controversial trip to the island, which is part of China, of course. Thank you very much. And that will do it for this edition of The Hub on CGTN. Thank you for watching. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing.